What's up guys, in this video we're going to be going over how we can make a data store for our Tycoon in Roblox Studio. Saving data is a classic feature in a lot of Tycoons these days, so we need to make sure we're staying up to date and on the trends with the whole data saving features and all that stuff, so let's get right into making that. First, what we need to do is open up Workspace, open up our Tycoons folder, and open up our Tycoon model. Next, we're going to click on the plus icon to the right of our Tycoon model, and we're going to search for a folder just like this. And this folder we're going to rename to purchases. There are a few things we kind of need to redo almost in order for our data store to work. So just by adding this folder purchases, and let's open up our core script inside of our scripts folder. There isn't anything that we need to change up here, so we're going to go down all the way down to our button function right here. And the first thing we need to change is this dependency part right here. We want to say, instead of if purchased items wait for child, we want to say Tycoon dot purchases wait for child. And then down here, we want to set where it says the object v object.value.parent equals to purchased items. We want to change this to Tycoon.purchases, just like that. Let's go down a bit more, and right here where it says purchased items.child added, we're going to say Tycoon.purchases.child added, and inside of our animate building in function that we're signaling down here, we also need to say Tycoon.purchases, just like that. The only thing that we need to change inside of our core script, except for right up here. But before we actually get to changing that, let's go back to our place right here, and inside of our Tycoons folder, let's click on the plus icon to the right of it, and let's search for a bindable event, just like this. And this event we are going to rename to Claim Tycoon, just like that. And then inside of our Tycoons folder one more time, let's click on the plus icon and add in a script. This script, let's rename to Save Data, just like that. And we can close off that script for now because there's still something we need to do inside of our core script. So inside of our core script, right below this main items.ownerdoor.title.surfaceGUI line right here, we just want to go down a line right here, and let's go ahead and say Tycoon.parent.claim.tycoon, and then we're going to do :fire, just like this, and then we're going to pass Tycoon as the parameter that we're going to be signaling to the other functions inside of our other script. Alright, so let's go over to server script service now, right here, open up leader stats, just like that, and we need to create a brand new object value inside of our player. So we're going to drop down a few lines underneath our has Tycoon instance. And we're going to say local Tycoon owned will be equal to instance.new bool value, not bool value, object value I mean, and we're going to parent this to the player just like that. Then we're going to say our Tycoon owned.name will be equal to quotation marks Tycoon owned. We don't need to set a value for this just yet because we're going to be doing that inside of our core script right here whenever the player claims the Tycoon. So we're actually going to go one line above wherever we fire this claim Tycoon event right here, and we're going to say player find first child Tycoon owned dot value, and this is going to be equal to Tycoon, just like that. So what this is doing is that whenever a player will claim the Tycoon, we're setting the Tycoon owned value that we just made inside of the player to that Tycoon, and then we're going to be using this so that whenever the player claims a Tycoon, we can actually load in their data later. And that's why we're also firing this bindable event for whenever the player claims a Tycoon, so that way we can go ahead and save their data. Let's go ahead and close off the core script and close off the leader stat script for now because we don't need it. Next, let's go ahead and grab our Tycoon right here. Press Ctrl and D to duplicate it, and let's move it over to server storage. So that will keep our Tycoon nice and comfy cozy right inside of there. Next, let's open up our save data script inside of our Tycoons folder that we added, and we need to get a few variables going. The first variable is going to be local players, and this will be equal to game get service players, just like that. Next, we need to get our data store service. So we're going to say local data store service. This will be equal to game get service quotation marks, data store service, just like that. And then we actually need to create a data store using our data store service. So we're going to say local data store will be equal to data store service colon get data store, and then we put quotation marks here, and this is where we get to actually create our data store. What most people will do while they're creating their game is they'll set this to production, or they'll set it to unofficial, or they'll set it to testing. It doesn't really matter what you do for this. I like to put it in a different name than what I'm going to be using for when the game is released, because that way while we're testing we might give ourselves an infinite amount of money or whatever, and we don't want to be at the top of the leaderboards right as our game gets released. That kind of ruins it for the other player. So what we want to do for this data store is just give it a name, whatever you want to name it for now. I'm just going to name it to my data store. And now we're going to create two different functions. One's going to load our data and one is going to save our data. Let's start with the save data function first. So we're going to say function save data. We're going to put parentheses right here. And this is going to take our player parameter just like that. Let's go ahead and press enter. And now what we're going to do is we're going to find the Tycoon the player owns through that Tycoon owned value that we put inside of the player. So we're going to say local Tycoon will be equal to player find first child parentheses quotation marks, and then this will be our Tycoon owned value that we just found, and then we're going to say dot value right there. So that is going to find the Tycoon that the player has claimed. Next, we actually want to find the purchases. So we want to say local purchases, and this will be equal to our player find first child Tycoon owned dot value, and then dot purchases, because that will find our purchases folder. After that, we want to say local Tycoon data will be equal to an empty table for now, as we're going to be inserting a lot of stuff into that next. We're actually going to start inserting that stuff now. So we're going to say for I, comma, object in I pairs, we're going to do purchases get children with parentheses just like that. And then we're going to put do at the end of this. Then we're going to say table.insert. We're going to put our Tycoon data, comma, and then we're going to grab our object.name just like that. So what this is going to do is it's going to loop through all of the objects in our purchases folder, and then it's going to insert the name of that object into our Tycoon data table. So now we're going to be using a thing called a protected call or a P call. Now what a P call is basically something that can run functions without erroring and provide if your code was successfully ran. The reason why we use P calls mostly for data stores and a ton of other functions is because since it doesn't error, it can still continue with the rest of the script even if there is an error or a problem. So we're going to say local success, comma, error, and this will be equal to P call function just like this, and we're going to put the parentheses at the end of that. And then here's where we're going to say data store colon set async, and this is going to be our player.user ID like that. We're going to put a comma and then our Tycoon data. So this is basically going to grab our Tycoon data table and it's going to save it to the player's user ID just like that. Next, we want to make sure that if it was an error, we want to warn the server. So we say if not success, then we're going to warn our error just like that. And that'll basically make it so that if in case our data wasn't saved, we can warn the server just like that. Now we want to make it so that whenever the player leaves, we delete the Tycoon they currently had and then we replace it with that Tycoon clone that we just made right here. So we're going to grab our new Tycoon, and this will be equal to game.server_storage find first child, and then we're going to do Tycoon.name. At the end of the find first child parentheses, we're going to say clone just like that. Then we're going to set new Tycoon.parent will be equal to Tycoon.parent. And then we're going to say our Tycoon destroy just like that because we no longer need it. Now let's go down a little bit and let's go ahead and create a function for when we load our data. We're actually going to be calling this whenever our claim Tycoon bindable event gets called. So we're going to say script.parent.claimTycoon.event, and we're going to connect a function to this. This function is going to take our Tycoon parameter just like that, because that is the Tycoon parameter that we were passing through earlier whenever the player actually claims their Tycoon. Now we're going to press enter just like this, and now we can find the owner of the Tycoon through that Tycoon. So we're going to say local Tycoon owner will be equal to tycoon.values.ownervalue.value. So that's going to find our owner value inside of our Tycoon. Next, we can set our Tycoon data just as an empty variable for now, because we're going to be changing that a little later. Later, I mean now, because we're going to create another P call. So we're going to say local success, comma error, and this will be equal to P call function, just like this again. And then we're going to set our Tycoon data, and this will be equal to data store get async this time, because we're getting the player's data. Then we're going to grab our Tycoon owner.user ID just like that. Once again, we check the if not success, then we're going to warn our error just like that. And below here, here's where we get to actually load in the player's data. So we're going to check if it's a success, as if we have saved the player's data or gotten the player's data in this case, and we have Tycoon data, then here's where we're going to create a Tycoon clone. And this will be equal to game.server_storage, and this is going to be find first child Tycoon.name, and then we're going to say clone at the end of that because we're creating a Tycoon clone. Then we want to say our Tycoon clone.parent will be equal to Tycoon.parent. We're basically setting all the properties of our Tycoon to our Tycoon clone because we're going to be deleting our normal Tycoon when we actually load the player's data. So now we say Tycoon clone.values.ownervalue.value equals to Tycoon.values.ownervalue, a capital O dot value, just like that. And then we get our Tycoon owner like that. And then we set their Tycoon owned value to Tycoon, just like that. Not Tycoon, the Tycoon clone I meant to say, just like that. Next, we tell our Tycoon to be destroyed, just like that, and then we can set our Tycoon clone, just like that, to our Tycoon up here so we don't run into any more errors. Now let's go ahead and retrieve the various folders from our clone Tycoon. So we're going to grab our local purchases folder, and this will be equal to our clone, our Tycoon clone, find first child purchases, because that is our purchases folder. We're going to say local purchased objects folder, or we're going to say local purchased items folder, and this will be equal to Tycoon clone find first child purchased items, just like that. And then we're going to grab our local buttons folder, and this will be equal to Tycoon clone find first child buttons folder, just like that. Then we're going to create a for loop that's going to loop through all of our buttons inside of our buttons folder and check if the object value inside of that button matches with the name of the object that we stored inside of the player right up here when we inserted the object's name into our Tycoon data table, which we saved to the player. Then we're basically going to move that object into our purchases folder in our new Tycoon. So let's say for I, comma, button in I pairs, we're going to say our buttons folder, get children, do, if it is, well, if our button, find first child object, then we're going to say local object will be equal to our purchased items folder, find first child, our button dot object dot value, just like that. Now, if it is our object and table dot find, our Tycoon data table object.name, then we're going to set the object.parent, and this will be equal to our purchases folder, and boom. So basically what this is doing is it's creating a loop through all of our buttons up here. It's checking if the button has a value called object. If it does, it's going to search through our purchased items folder and it's going to find that object. If it does find the object and that object is inside of our Tycoon data table, then it's going to move that object to the purchases folder. Another thing we need to do though now is that we need to hide the button for that object so the player can't buy multiple of that object. So let's go right up here after our save data function right here, and let's say local function, and this is going to be buttons, just like this. Let's name it buttons or whatever name you want to give it. And then this is going to take the parameter of button, just like that. We open up our Tycoon model, open up our buttons folder, and then open up one of our buttons right here. Let's go ahead and grab our button, open that up. You can see that we have a button part inside of our button model, and inside of that part we have our billboard GUI. So what we want to say is button.button, that's getting our button part. Then we want to say .canCollide will be equal to false, and then button.button.transparency will be equal to 1, and our button.button.billboard GUI.enabled will be equal to false, just like that. So this is basically grabbing everything about our buttons and then hiding them. So now we have that function for our buttons. Down here below where we set our object.parent to the purchases folder, we want to go ahead and say our buttons function right here, and then we're going to pass our button as the parameter to that. So now we have our load data function right here, our save data function, and our function for our buttons. We can actually call these functions whenever we need to. So in this load function, we already have it running whenever we want to, and that is whenever the player claims the Tycoon. However, down here, we need to make sure that the player actually saves the data when they leave. So we're going to grab our players variable from the top, and we're going to say players.playerRemoving, and we're going to connect a function to that, and this function is going to take the parameter of player. Next, we just say our save data function, and we pass the player parameter to that. And that is all we have to do. So what this is going to do is that if the player gets kicked or if the player leaves, it's going to save the data for that player. So now in case the game crashes, we want to make sure that we also save the player's data. So what we want to say is game:bind to close, which means if the game gets shut down for any reason, then we're going to call a function. We're going to loop through all of the players. So we're going to say for I, player in I pairs, and we're going to say game.players get players, not get players from character, but get players. And then we're going to do this, and we're going to call our save data for that player, so that way we save their data even if the game crashes. Let's go over this script now piece by piece. So this is our players service that we're getting inside of this variable. Pretty explanatory. These two variables right here are creating and setting up our data store. Keep in mind you can change this data store name to whatever you want to. Next, we're creating a save data function for our player. So we're finding the Tycoon from the Tycoon owned value that the player has. So we're going to find whatever Tycoon the player owns at that moment when they leave. We're going to find the purchases folder from that Tycoon. We're going to create a new empty table called Tycoon data that we later in this function right here insert the objects names that are inside of our purchases folder to the Tycoon data table. Then we create a protected function right here that is going to run whether it gets a success or an error, and we're going to save that data to the player right here. Next, we create a new Tycoon, and then we destroy the old Tycoon so that way a new player can have fun inside of the game. Next, right here, we have a function that will go ahead and basically make our buttons completely invisible. And then right here, so whenever the player actually claims the Tycoon, that bindable event that we made earlier is going to fire, and then we're going to run a function off of it. So we grab the Tycoon owner, which is a player, from the owner value of that Tycoon, and then we grab our Tycoon data from the data store that we saved earlier, and then we check that if there are no errors in the P call and we have the player's Tycoon data, we basically go ahead and make a brand new Tycoon for them, and then right here inside of this function, we take all of the objects inside of their purchased items folder, and then we load it in for the player if we find the object's name inside of the Tycoon data table that we made earlier. Next, right here, we check if the player leaves, we save the data, and if the game crashes, we save the data. Now we can X off of our script, and there's one more thing that we need to do. Next, we need to go to game settings right up here, go to security right here, and then we need to enable studio access to API services. Now, if you're in a team create with someone else, you need to make sure that the owner of the game actually sets this to enabled, otherwise it will not work. But once you do set this to enabled, click on save, and then that will go ahead and save the changes we just made. Let's go ahead and click play and see what happens. So the Tycoon is right over here. Now whenever we claim the Tycoon, as you can see, since we don't have any data at the moment, it's not going to load any data in. However, let's go ahead and buy a dropper real quick. Let's run over here, select a cache right here. Let's go over to our button. Let's buy the colorizer. Now let's say we left just like this by stopping the game. Give it a second or two. Now we go ahead and click on play once again. Alrighty, I made a mistake here. Instead of saying Tycoon equals to Tycoon clone, I accidentally said Tycoon clone equals to Tycoon. And the difference between these is quite drastic as we just deleted the Tycoon. So let's go ahead and swap these around real quick and say Tycoon will be equal to Tycoon clone, just like this. Let's go ahead and click play now. So going over here, if I claim my Tycoon real quick, I don't have any data in my Tycoon whatsoever yet. However, if I go ahead and buy a few buttons here, let's buy the first dropper, go over here, collect the cache, let's go over buy the colorizer real quick, just like that. Alright, so now we have two objects in our Tycoon. If we open up the workspace, Tycoons folder, Tycoon model, and then our purchases folder, you can see that we have our two items inside of our purchases folder here. Now, let's say I were to leave by clicking the stop button right up here. We now have some data created for the game to go off of. So let's go ahead and click play one more time. Now that we have data, as you can see, whenever I claim this Tycoon, my dropper and my colorizer will load in because I actually have that data saved to the player. So this is actually very, very nice, very handy, and I absolutely love the Tycoon data saving feature. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video just as much as I did, make sure you like, subscribe, and comment down below. See you next time.